Welcome back to Behind Closed Doors Revenge Stories, where quiet people finally tell the truth about the families that underestimated them. If stories about betrayal, backbone, and starting over speak to you, drop a comment below and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens when the quiet one stops staying quiet. My name is Diane Kowalski. I'm 54 years old, and for most of my life I was the kind of woman people looked past. Not unkind to, just past. The one who remembers everyone's coffee order and nobody's birthday but her own gets forgotten too. I want to tell you about the year that changed, but I have to warn you, it doesn't start with anything dramatic. It starts with a folding chair. I was sitting in a folding chair in a conference room above Petrovich and Lund law offices on Main Street in Beloit, Wisconsin, in a beige blazer I'd bought specifically for this meeting because I wanted to look like a woman who belonged in a room where a will was being read, even though some part of me already knew I wasn't going to be treated like I did. My brother Gary was across the table in a golf polo, like he'd stopped by on his way to somewhere more important. My mother, Sharon, sat between us, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually producing tears, the way she always did when she wanted the room to feel a certain way about her. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Arthur Lund who'd known my stepfather for 30 years, cleared his throat and started reading, and I remember the exact moment the air went out of the room for me. It was the sentence where he said the controlling interest in Kowalski Hardware and Supply, the store I had run, day in and day out, for 21 years, was being left in full to my brother Gary. Not split. Not shared. Not even acknowledged, really, beyond a smile in recognition of her years of service that came later, like a parting gift for an employee instead of language for a daughter. I sat there in my new blazer with my hands folded in my lap, and I did not cry, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not do a single thing that would have given anyone in that room the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I just sat very still and thought, so this is how it ends. 21 years, and I get a sentence. But that's not where this story starts. That's just the moment I finally understood it. To tell you how we got there, I have to take you back before the will, back before the store even had my stepfather's name on the sign, back to a kitchen in Rockford, Illinois, where I was 9 years old and learning, without anyone ever saying it out loud, exactly where I stood in that family. My mother married Walter Kowalski when I was 7. My biological father had left 2 years before that, not dramatically, just quietly, the way some men do, a job transfer that never came with a forwarding address. Walter was a good man in a lot of ways. He worked with his hands, he came home smelling like sawdust and motor oil, and when he laughed, which wasn't often, it filled up a whole room. He never once raised a hand to me. I want to be fair about that, because this isn't a story about cruelty, not really. It's a story about the small, patient math of favoritism, the kind that adds up over 20 years until one day you look at the total and it takes your breath away. Gary was born the year after Walter and my mother married. He was Walter's own blood, and from the day he came home from the hospital, something in the house rearranged itself around him, the way furniture gets rearranged around a new baby, except this rearrangement never stopped. When Gary struggled in school, Walter hired him a tutor. When I struggled, and I did, math especially, my mother told me I probably wasn't going to need algebra to be a homemaker someday, so not to worry about it too much. I was 12 when she said that. I remember it exactly, standing at the kitchen counter with a spelling test in my hand that I'd actually done well on, and somehow the conversation had drifted to what I was and wasn't going to need in life, and none of it included ambition. I don't think my mother set out to be unfair. I think she believed, in some bone-deep unexamined way, that Gary's future mattered more because he carried Walter's name and Walter's blood, and that I was a kind of guest in the family who should be grateful for room and board. Nobody ever said that sentence. Families like mine don't say the sentence. They just live it, meal after meal, birthday after birthday, until the shape of it is so familiar you stop seeing it as a shape at all. You just think it's the weather. I remember one Christmas in particular, the year I was 13 and Gary was 12, that I've come back to more than almost any other memory from that house. There was a bicycle under the tree that year, a good one, a real Schwinn with a proper gear shift, wrapped in paper with a bow so big it looked like it belonged in a department store window. It was for Gary. I remember watching him tear the paper off it, remember Walter's face lit up with the particular pride fathers get watching their sons receive something they'd saved up for. My gift that year was a sewing kit and a set of hand-me-down winter boots from a cousin, practical, needed, entirely reasonable by the accounting of a household budget, and I want to be fair, we didn't have much money in those years. Walter's business was young and struggling, and I understand now, as an adult, that choices had to be made. But even a 13-year-old girl can do the math of attention, if not the math of dollars. It wasn't really about the bicycle. It was about the fact that nobody in that room seemed to notice I'd noticed. My mother caught me looking at the boots a beat too long and said, brightly, too brightly, "Aren't those a good sturdy pair, Diane? You'll get so much use out of them," and I said yes, they were lovely, thank you, because I had already learned, by 13, that the correct response to feeling smaller than someone else in your own family was gratitude, performed cheerfully, immediately, so no one had to sit with the discomfort of what had actually just happened. I didn't resent Gary for the bicycle, not exactly, not even then. He was 12. He didn't ask for the imbalance any more than I did. What I resented, slowly, over years of Christmases and birthdays and quiet moments like that one, was the machinery underneath it, the assumption, never spoken, that his wants were requirements and mine were preferences, that his future was a project the whole family invested in and mine was something I'd have to build in whatever margins were left over. I got very good, in those years, at not asking for things. Not because I didn't want them. Because I had learned that asking, for me, tended to produce a certain look on my mother's face, patient, a little tired, like I was adding a complication to a budget that had already been carefully allocated elsewhere, and I decided, somewhere around 14 or 15, that I would rather do without than see that look again. There was another moment, a few years after the bicycle Christmas, that I think mattered even more, though it took me decades to understand why. I was 17, finishing up my senior year, and I'd gotten it into my head that I wanted to study business at the State University 2 hours north, nothing fancy, just a solid degree that I thought, even then, might let me run something of my own someday. I brought it up at dinner one night, carefully, the way I brought up most things I actually wanted, testing the water before committing to wanting it out loud. My mother's response wasn't cruel. It never was, not in the obvious way. She said, kindly enough, that college was expensive, and that with Gary likely to need help getting established in a few years, he was only 16 at the time, nothing about his future was remotely decided yet, but she spoke of it like settled fact. The family probably couldn't stretch to cover both of us properly, and didn't I think it made more sense for me to keep working at the store, where I already had a foot in the door, rather than take on debt for a degree I might not even end up using. I remember Walter not saying anything at all during that conversation, which somehow hurt more than if he'd agreed with her outright. I ended up taking 2 classes at the community college over the following few years, paying for them myself out of my store wages, one at a time, whenever I'd saved up enough, while continuing to work full days at the store in between. I never finished the degree. Life, and the store, and eventually Ray, and eventually just the sheer exhausting logistics of trying to do it all at once, got in the way it does for so many people who are quietly told, early on, that their ambitions are the flexible ones in the family, the ones that can be set aside when money's tight, unlike a brother's, which apparently could not. Gary, for what it's worth, did go to college, a decent state school, paid for in full, and he dropped out after 3 semesters, which nobody in my family ever discussed with the same disappointed weight they'd have used if I'd done the same thing. It was framed, gently, as him figuring things out. I don't think anyone in my family ever once, in all the years since, framed anything I did as figuring things out. I was just expected to have already figured it out, quietly, on my own, without anyone's help, and to be grateful for the opportunity to keep proving it. Supply got added, stocking shelves, running the register, learning how to explain to customers the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead, and how to talk a nervous first-time homeowner through fixing a leaky faucet without making them feel stupid for asking. Gary worked there too, technically. He'd show up late, leave early, and somehow still be the one Walter introduced to suppliers as the future of the business. I loved that store, though. I want you to understand that, because it matters for what comes later. I loved the smell of it, cut lumber and machine oil, and the particular staleness of an old cash register. I loved knowing where everything was, down to the exact bin. I loved the regulars, the old men who came in every Saturday for nothing in particular and stayed to talk, the young couples buying their first paint rollers for their first house. By the time I was 25, I wasn't just working there. I was running it, in every way that mattered, even though Walter's name was still the one on the door and, eventually, the one on most of the paperwork. I want to give you a sense of what that actually looked like, day to day, because I think it matters for understanding just how completely I'd built my life around that place. I was the one who opened at 7, which meant I was the one who knew which of the fluorescent lights in the back aisle had started flickering and needed replacing before a customer complained about it. I was the one who'd memorized, over the years, which contractors paid on net 30 like clockwork and which ones needed a gentle reminder call around day 25. I renegotiated our lumber supplier contract twice, once in my early 30s and once again a few years later, saving the store enough on cost per board foot that Walter, in a rare moment of open praise, told one of his golf buddies I had a head for numbers better than his own. I built the seasonal displays every spring and fall, hauled bags of mulch myself when we were short-staffed, learned enough basic plumbing and electrical from listening to customers and reading manuals in the evenings that I could talk a first-time homeowner through almost any small repair over the counter. When our longtime part-timer Doris retired, I was the one who trained her replacement, because Walter said, without a trace of irony, that I just had a knack for teaching people the ropes, never quite connecting that knack to what it might mean about who was actually running the place. None of that showed up anywhere official. Not on a business card, not on a title, not on the sign out front. It showed up in 21 years of invoices with my handwriting on them, and in a town's worth of people who, when they thought the hardware store, pictured my face behind the counter before they pictured anyone else's. Here's the thing about being the responsible one in a family like mine: you don't get thanked for it, you get relied on for it, and there's a difference that took me a long time to understand. When Walter's back started giving him trouble in his 50s, I picked up the slack without being asked, because that's what you do when you love something. When Gary helped out for 6 months and then decided retail wasn't really his thing and went off to try selling insurance, then real estate, then some multi-level vitamin company that folded within a year, I never said a word about it, because saying something would have made me the difficult one, and I had learned a long time before that being difficult was not a luxury I was permitted. My breaking point didn't come all at once. It built the way rust builds, slow, quiet, and then one day the metal gives out from underneath you and you're standing on the floor wondering how you didn't see it coming, when really you'd seen it coming for years and just kept telling yourself it would look different once you understood it better. The moment I actually let myself feel it, though, the moment I stopped absorbing it and let it land, happened about 8 months before that reading in the conference room, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at the store. Walter had passed away 4 months earlier, after a short, hard fight with pancreatic cancer that none of us were ready for even though the doctors had warned us. I still remember the last real conversation I had with him, about 2 weeks before he got too weak to talk much, sitting beside his hospital bed while a nurse changed out in 4 bag in the hallway. He'd taken my hand, his grip already thinner than it used to be, and told me the store had always run better with me in it than it ever had with just him, and that he hoped I knew that. I told him I did. I believed, at the time, that he meant it as a kind of blessing and assurance, and it comforted me for months afterward. It wasn't until later that I understood how much that sentence was actually costing him to say, given what he already knew and I didn't yet, that the paperwork sitting in Arthur Lund's office told a very different story than the one he was telling me from that hospital bed. I've had to make my peace with that contradiction. I don't think he was lying to me. I think he was a man running out of time, trying to give me something true in the only currency he had left, even though he'd already, years earlier, made a different decision on paper that he never found the courage to walk back or explain. The funeral itself was the kind of blur most people describe, casseroles arriving faster than we could eat them, relatives I hadn't seen in a decade offering condolences with the particular formality reserved for people you don't actually know how to comfort, my mother moving through the receiving line like a woman performing a role she'd rehearsed without quite believing in it. Gary gave the eulogy. I remember sitting in the second pew, not the first, and noticing that detail even through my grief, filing it away the way I'd been filing away small details like that my whole life. In the chaos of the funeral and the estate paperwork, I had simply kept doing what I'd always done, opening the store at 7, closing it at 6, handling the vendors, running payroll for our 4 part-time employees, keeping the whole thing breathing. Gary had come around more in those months than he had in years, and for a while I let myself believe grief was changing him, softening him, making him finally see what the store meant. Then, on that Tuesday, I overheard him on the phone in the back office, the door not quite shut, talking to someone from the bank about when I take over and my long-term plans for the space, and it wasn't the words themselves that stopped me cold in the hallway with a box of drywall anchors in my arms. It was the tone. Easy. Assumed. Like a man discussing a house he already owned, not one still in probate, not one his sister had built her whole adult life around. I set the box down very quietly and I walked out to my car and I sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes, not crying, just breathing, feeling something in my chest reorganize itself the way the furniture in that house had rearranged itself for Gary 30-some years earlier. And I thought, clear as a bell, for the first time in my life, this was never going to be mine. Not because I didn't earn it. Because I was never going to be allowed to. I didn't quit that day. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think people expect these stories to have a clean, dramatic exit, and mine didn't. I went back inside, I finished stocking the drywall anchors, and I helped an elderly man named Frank find the right size washer for his outdoor spigot, and I smiled the whole time, because that's what 20 years of being underestimated teaches you to do. You get very, very good at smiling. But something had shifted, and the person who noticed first wasn't anyone in my family. It was my friend Carol. Carol Jezik and I had known each other since we were in our 20s, back when she worked the deli counter 2 doors down from the store and we used to take our lunch breaks together on the bench outside, splitting a bag of pretzels because neither of us could afford much more than that in those days. Carol had gone on to manage the deli, then the whole grocery store, and had retired the year before with a pension and a small camper she and her husband took up to the Wisconsin Dells every summer. She was blunt in a way I had never learned how to be, and I loved her for it, because she said the things about my family that I wasn't allowed to say myself. It was Carol I called that evening after the Tuesday with the drywall anchors, and it was Carol I told, a few weeks later, about the thing that happened at Target, because I needed to laugh about something, and that story, ridiculous as it was the only thing in my life at the time that was purely, uncomplicatedly funny. I'd gone in on my day off to stock up on my body wash, the good stuff, the kind you have to buy 3 bottles of at a time because the store's always rearranging the beauty aisle and you never know when they'll discontinue your scent. I was wearing a red t-shirt, no reason, just laundry day logic, and I was digging through the shelf trying to find a bottle that wasn't hidden behind 40 bottles of something else, moving things around to see what was actually back there. A woman came up beside me, middle-aged, irritated before she even opened her mouth, and asked me, not politely, where a particular item was. Now here's a thing you should know about me by then, I got mistaken for a store employee constantly. Target, Walmart, Costco, the Woodman's out on the highway, even the Meijer over in Rockford when I'd go visit my cousin. It happened so often my husband used to joke I had the face of someone who knows where the toilet paper is. I never minded helping when I could. I'd point people in the right direction, and if I didn't know, I'd just say so, I don't work here, sorry, I don't shop here enough to know. I started to say exactly that to this woman. I got about 3 words in, I don't work, before she cut me off and told me, quite sharply, that it was my job to know, and I needed to look it up for her. I want you to understand something about where I was in my life at that exact moment. I had spent 21 years being told, in 1,000 quiet ways, that showing up and doing the work wasn't enough to earn me a claim to anything. I had just, weeks earlier, overheard my own brother talk about his store like I was furniture in it. And now a total stranger in a Target was standing in front of me insisting I owed her labor I hadn't agreed to give, simply because she'd decided, without asking, what my role was supposed to be. Something in me, quiet, controlled, the same something that had been quiet and controlled for 21 years, simply declined to bend. I dropped the smile. I said, "That's not my job." She scoffed, told me my manager was going to hear about this, and I said, plainly, "Look, I don't work here, so I can't help you." She walked off in a huff, and I went back to hunting for my body wash, thinking that was the end of it, mildly annoyed but mostly just amused at the absurdity of being threatened with a manager I did not have. I paid at self-checkout and was walking out when I heard someone shout "Excuse me," behind me. I turned, and there was my Target stranger, now standing at the returns desk, apparently having gone and found someone to escalate to. I kept walking, because whatever her problem was, it wasn't mine, and I had groceries in my car that needed to get into the fridge. "Where do you think you're going?" a new voice called out, and this time I stopped and turned around, receipt still in my hand from the self-checkout, because some instinct told me I was about to need proof of something. A woman in a red Target polo, a manager, evidently, judging by the badge and the tone, looked me up and down, taking in my red shirt and my shorts, and informed me, with real authority, that I was not in proper uniform, and did I understand that was grounds for termination. Carol, when I told her this part, laughed so hard she had to put her coffee down. I could have just told her right then that I didn't work there. It would have ended the whole thing in about 4 seconds. But I'll admit something to you, some small, tired, 21 years underestimated part of me wanted to see how far this was going to go. I said, "I didn't know I needed a uniform to shop here." "You think you're so funny, don't you?" the manager snapped. "Well," I said, "I don't work for you, so I don't know why it matters." I watched her face change, that particular collapse a person's expression does when the ground they were standing on turns out not to be there. She looked at my purse, my keys already out in my hand, the grocery bag hanging off my wrist, the receipt I was holding up without even being asked. "I am so sorry," she said, mortified. "That woman pointed you out and told me you were an employee refusing to do your job. I thought you were someone else." I shrugged and told her, not unkindly, that maybe she should pay a little more attention to what her actual employees looked like, so the next time a Karen tried to get someone fired, she didn't nearly fire a total stranger buying body wash. She nodded, apologized again, and turned back inside. The original woman had apparently watched the whole exchange from just inside the doors, arms crossed, face like she'd bitten into something sour, and a young guy walking in laughed so hard he had to lean on a cart. I got in my car feeling, for the first time in months, like I had won something, even if it was the smallest, silliest possible thing to win. "You beat 2 Karens in one day," Carol said when I told her, wiping her eyes. "Diane, you've got more backbone than you give yourself credit for. You just never use it on the people who actually deserve it." I laughed it off at the time. But I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the year since, because Carol wasn't wrong, and some part of me knew it even as I was laughing. Carol became, without either of us really naming it, the person who saw me clearly during that whole stretch of time, the store, the will, all of it. So did my husband, Ray, a quiet man who fixes furnaces for a living and has never once in 26 years of marriage told me I was asking for too much. And so, in a way I didn't expect, did my stepfather's old accountant, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth Alvarez who had done the books for Kowalski Hardware for almost as long as I'd worked there, and who called me, unprompted, about 2 weeks after the will was read, and asked if I had a few minutes to talk somewhere that wasn't the store. That phone call is where this story actually starts to turn. Ruth asked me to meet her at a coffee shop on the other side of town, not the diner near the store where half our customers might wander in. That alone told me something. Ruth was not a dramatic woman. In 15 years of doing the store's books, I had never once seen her rattled. She was rattled that day. She told me she'd been going through old files, boxing up records the way you do when a business changes hands, and she'd found something in a folder that had been misfiled years ago, tucked behind old tax returns from a decade back. It was a copy of a will. Not the will Arthur Lund had read in that conference room. An earlier one, dated almost 11 years before Walter's death, drawn up not by Lund but by a lawyer in Rockford whose practice, Ruth had confirmed with a quick phone call, had closed years ago when the man retired. In that will, Walter had left the controlling interest in the store to me. Not to Gary. To me, by name, with language about my 2 decades of dedication and expertise that made my hands shake so badly I had to set my coffee down. I sat there in that coffee shop reading a photocopy of a document that legally meant nothing anymore. Wills get superseded, and Arthur Lund's version was clearly the more recent one, dated less than a year before Walter's death, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. Because it meant, at some point in the last decade, my stepfather had changed his mind. And I needed to understand why, and when, and who had been in the room when he did it. Ruth didn't know the answer. But she told me something else, quietly, over her tea, that she said she probably shouldn't. About 8 years back, not long after Gary's second failed business venture, Walter had come into the office looking gray and tired and asked Ruth, off the record, whether the store could absorb another loan if he needed to help Gary out of a jam. Ruth had told him it could, if it had to, but that it would set the business back for years. Walter had thanked her and never mentioned it again. Ruth assumed, at the time, that he'd found another way to help Gary. She never saw the loan on the books. I didn't sleep well for the next several nights, turning that conversation over. My mother had always talked about Walter's will like it reflected some deep, settled truth about who deserved what. Gary was his blood, I was not, end of story, nothing personal, just biology. But if Walter had once written a will that named me, by name, with language that sounded almost proud, then something had changed his mind later, and my mother's whole insistence that this had always been the plan was not quite the truth she'd let me believe. I want to be careful here, because I promised you at the start this wasn't a story about villains, and it isn't. What I came to understand, slowly, over the weeks that followed, is that Walter had likely quietly bailed Gary out of something years before his death, a debt, maybe, or a mess bigger than a failed insurance career, and had done it not through a documented loan but by rewriting his own will to make Gary's inheritance of the business itself the repayment. It let him help his son without ever having to say the humiliating word bailout out loud, to Gary or to himself. It let him tie up a debt in a bow labeled inheritance. And it let my mother keep believing, or keep telling herself, that this was simply always how it was going to be, because the alternative, admitting Gary had needed rescuing, more than once, in ways that cost his sister her rightful place, was more than she wanted to carry. None of that made it fair to me. But it did make it human, and understanding that mattered more than I expected it to. I started gathering everything I could find. Not out of some plan for a courtroom battle, I want to be honest, I never once believed I could contest a properly executed will, and I didn't want to spend what was left of my relationship with my mother fighting over money in front of a judge. What I wanted was simpler and, in its own way, harder. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of my own memory. I wanted it written down, documented, undeniable, so that no one in my family could ever again tell me, with a straight face, that this had always been the plan, that I had never been meant for more than what I'd been given. I made copies of everything at the library, not at the store, because by then I didn't fully trust who might see what came through that copier. I kept a folder, old invoices with my handwriting on every page for 2 decades, vendor contracts I'd negotiated, a stack of thank you cards from customers addressed to Diane at the hardware store going back years, the photocopy of the old will, notes from my conversation with Ruth. I wasn't building a legal case. I was building a record of a life, because somewhere in the last several months I had understood that if I didn't do it myself, no one else in that family ever would. Ray watched me do this most evenings at our kitchen table, folder spread out, reading glasses on, and one night he set his hand on top of mine and said, "You know you don't have to prove anything to them. You already know what you did." I told him I knew that. But I also told him that knowing something quietly, alone, for 21 years, was exactly what had gotten me a folding chair and a sentence, And I wasn't going to let that happen again without at least making the truth impossible to ignore. The letter came about 3 weeks into all of this, and it came from a person I hadn't expected, Walter's younger sister, my aunt by marriage, Delphine, who lived downstate near Springfield and who I saw maybe twice a year, mostly at holidays, usually seated near the end of the table where the conversation didn't quite reach her. Delphine had never had much to do with the day-to-day of the store or the family drama around it. But she had loved her brother, and she wrote to me, an actual letter, in careful cursive, the kind almost nobody writes anymore, a few weeks after the funeral, saying she'd heard through my mother how the will had gone, and she wanted to tell me something Walter had said to her, privately, at Thanksgiving the year before he got sick. He'd told her, she wrote, that he worried he'd made a mess of things with the will business, that he'd done right by Gary the only way he knew how at the time, but that it had cost him something he wasn't proud of, and that Diane, that was me, deserved better than what she was going to get, and he hoped I'd understand someday, and he hoped Gary would do right by me even if the paperwork didn't. Delphine wrote that she hadn't known what to do with that conversation for months, and she still didn't, entirely, but she thought I should have it, because a dying man's hope wasn't worth much if nobody ever spoke it out loud. I read that letter at my kitchen table with Ray asleep upstairs, and I cried for the first time since the whole thing started, not sad tears, not exactly, something more complicated than that, something closer to being seen by a man who was no longer alive to see me himself. It didn't change the will. It didn't change the store's ownership. But it changed something in me. It gave me, finally, something I hadn't had in that conference room with the folding chair, permission. Not legal permission. The other kind. The kind that says, you're allowed to say something now. You're allowed to stop absorbing this quietly and let it be known. There was one evening, about a week before I finally called Arthur Lund to arrange the second meeting, when Gary showed up at the store after closing, unannounced, while I was doing the nightly till count. I hadn't told anyone what I'd found, not Gary, not my mother, only Ruth, Carol, and Ray knew, but Gary had apparently heard from someone, maybe Ruth, maybe just the general static of a small town where nothing stays quiet for long, that I'd been asking questions about the estate. He stood in the doorway of the back office in his golf polo, looking less certain of himself than I'd seen him look in years, and asked me, without much preamble, what exactly I thought I was doing. I remember setting down the stack of 20s in my hand very deliberately, buying myself a second to decide how I wanted this conversation to go, because I could feel the old habit rising in me, the instinct to apologize, to soften it, to make myself smaller so he wouldn't feel threatened. I didn't do that. I told him, plainly, that I was making sure I understood the full history of the business I'd given my entire adult life to, and that if that made him uncomfortable, he might want to think about why. He got defensive, the way people do when they suspect, somewhere underneath the defensiveness, that they're standing on ground that isn't as solid as they'd like. He said something about how Dad's will was Dad's will, and it wasn't up for relitigating just because I was upset about it. I told him I wasn't trying to relitigate anything, that if he'd let me finish, he'd understand this wasn't about a courtroom, it was about the two of us finally having an honest conversation as adults, something we hadn't really had in about 15 years. That seemed to catch him off guard more than anything else I said. He stood there for a long moment, jaw working, and then he asked, quieter, almost like the question cost him something, whether I was planning on leaving. It was the first time in that whole stretch of months that I heard something in his voice that sounded like real fear, not of losing an argument, but of losing me, of what the store, and maybe even his own life, would look like without me quietly holding half of it together. I told him I hadn't decided yet, which was true, and that whether I stayed was going to depend a great deal on what happened at the next meeting with Arthur. He left without much more to say, and I finished the till count with my hands shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, more from the strange unfamiliar feeling of having just told my brother something true and uncomfortable to his face and survived it. I decided I wasn't going to sue anybody, and I wasn't going to scream at a family dinner, and I certainly wasn't going to do anything that would let my mother recast me, yet again, as the difficult one. I was going to do what I had always done best. I was going to walk in prepared, lay everything out clearly and calmly, and let the truth do the work I had been too polite to do myself for 21 years. I asked Arthur Lund if I could come by his office again, not for any legal filing, just to talk, and to my relief he agreed and even offered to have Gary and my mother join, since he said, in his careful lawyer's way, that some conversations go better on neutral ground than at a kitchen table where old habits take over before anyone said a word. We met on a Thursday morning in October, 6 weeks after the will was read, in the same conference room, the same long table, though this time I didn't wear the beige blazer. I wore my regular work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, because I decided I was done dressing like I needed to earn a seat at that table. I brought my folder. Gary showed up 10 minutes late, which surprised no one. My mother sat again in the middle, already dabbing at her eyes before anyone had said anything worth crying about. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to know that, because I think the version of this story people expect involves shouting, maybe some plates thrown, a scene straight out of a soap opera. That's not what happened, and honestly, I don't think it would have worked if it had. I laid the folder on the table, and I started, quietly, with the invoices, 21 years of them, my handwriting on every single one, going back to when I was 25 years old and Walter still called me kiddo instead of trusting me with the ordering. I laid out the vendor contracts I'd negotiated over the years, the ones with better terms than the store had ever gotten before I took that over. I laid out the thank you cards, dozens of them, addressed to me by name, from customers who'd never once needed to ask who ran that place. Then I laid out the photocopy of the old will. My mother went very pale. Gary reached for it, read it, and set it down without a word, his jaw working the way it used to when he was a teenager and got caught in something. Arthur Lund, to his credit, looked at it carefully and confirmed, gently, that it was a legitimate prior will, superseded by the one he'd drafted, meaning it carried no legal weight now, but I told him, and I told the room, that I wasn't there about legal weight. I was there because I wanted my family to stop pretending this had always, simply, obviously, been the plan. I told them about my conversation with Ruth, about the loan Walter had considered years back, about Delphine's letter, which I read aloud, my voice steady even though my hands were not. I watched my mother's face while I read it. I watched something in her, some old, practiced posture of "we don't talk about this," finally buckle. She said, very quietly, that she hadn't known about the earlier will. I believe her. I don't think Walter ever told her the specifics of what he'd changed or why, only that it was handled, the way men of his generation liked to say things were handled without explaining what handling meant. But she also admitted, haltingly, that she'd known Gary owed money around that time, serious money, and that she'd never asked Walter directly how it got resolved, because some part of her hadn't wanted to know the answer. Gary didn't say much for a long time. When he finally did, it wasn't the version of him I expected, not defensive, not smug, just tired, and a little bit ashamed, which was almost harder to watch than anger would have been. He said he hadn't known there'd been an earlier will either. He said he'd assumed, the way you assume the ground under your feet, that the store was always going to be his, because that's what he'd been told, quietly, his whole life, the same way I'd been told the opposite. He said he knew he didn't run that place the way I did. He said it in a voice that sounded, for the first time in years, almost young. I told him I wasn't there to take the store from him through some legal maneuver, because I didn't believe that was the right way to fix 21 years of imbalance, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life fighting my own brother in a courtroom. What I told him, and this is the part I'd rehearsed the most, alone in my car in the parking lot the morning before, was that I wanted a real partnership agreement, drawn up properly, with my name on the ownership documents alongside his, reflecting what had actually been true for 21 years even if the will never had. I wanted a fair salary going forward, not the modest one I'd been paid for 2 decades while running the place like it was mine, because it had been mine in every way that mattered except the one that was ever written down. And I told him, plainly, that if he wasn't willing to do that, I was prepared to walk away entirely, take my 21 years of institutional knowledge and my relationships with every vendor and every regular customer with me, and let him find out exactly how hard it was going to be to run that store without me. It wasn't a threat delivered in anger. It was just the truth, laid out as calmly as the invoices had been. Arthur Lund, to his credit, let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. He said, gently, that in his 30 years of practice he'd seen very few family business disputes handled with as much documentation and as little theater as what I'd just laid on the table, and that in his professional opinion, what I was asking for was, if anything, modest given what the paperwork showed. I hadn't asked for his opinion, but I was grateful for it anyway, because I watched it land on Gary in a way my own words alone might not have. My mother spoke next, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. She asked me, almost pleading, whether this meant I hated Walter now, hated what he'd done. I told her no, that was one of the harder things to explain, but I tried. I told her I'd made my peace, mostly, with understanding Walter as a flawed, tired man trying to solve one problem in a way that created another, a man who loved both his children imperfectly and ran out of time to fix his own mistake before it became permanent. I told her what I couldn't make peace with was the story she and Gary had both apparently agreed to keep telling themselves and me, that this had simply always been the plan, that there was nothing to discuss, that my only appropriate response was gratitude for whatever scraps came my way. I told her that story was the thing I needed to end today, more than I needed any particular dollar figure or percentage on a document. Gary, to his credit, and I want to give him this credit, because it would have been easy for him not to, didn't try to argue with any of that. He sat with it. At one point he put both hands flat on the table, the way Walter used to when he was working up to saying something difficult, and said that he'd spent so many years being handed things without earning them that he'd honestly stopped noticing it happening, the way you stop noticing a hum in a room you've lived in long enough. He said watching me lay out that folder, invoice after invoice, year after year, was the first time in a long time he'd actually had to look at what 21 years of somebody else's competence looked like laid end to end, instead of just benefiting from it without ever really seeing it. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it, but I also told him I wasn't interested in this becoming a moment where I comforted him for feeling bad about it. I'd spent enough years managing everyone else's comfort in that family. I needed this conversation to end in something concrete, not just something emotionally satisfying for the room. That's when we took the break I mentioned, the one where my mother and I stood outside on the sidewalk in the October chill. When we came back in, Arthur laid out, in practical terms, what a new partnership structure could look like, a genuine 50-50 ownership split going forward, my back pay addressed through a negotiated signing bonus rather than years of litigation over back wages, and a clear operating agreement that put both our names, and both our voices, on record for any major decision about the store going forward. Gary agreed to all of it that same afternoon, on the spot, without asking for time to think it over, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened in that room. I think, in his own way, he'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally make the invisible math visible enough that he couldn't keep pretending not to see it. Gary didn't answer right away. Arthur Lund suggested we take a break, get some air, let things settle, and I remember standing outside on the sidewalk in the October chill with my mother, who came out after me, her arms wrapped around herself, and who said, without quite looking at me, that she was sorry. Not a big dramatic apology. Just those two words, quiet, the way most true things in my family got said. I told her I appreciated it, and I meant it, but I also told her that sorry wasn't going to undo 21 years by itself, and that I needed her to actually see me differently going forward, not just feel bad for an afternoon. She nodded. I don't know, even now, how much that conversation actually changed in her. Some things in people don't rearrange themselves easily, even after 50 years of practice doing it for someone else's sake. We went back inside, and Gary agreed, not enthusiastically, not with some Hollywood moment of brotherly reconciliation, but tiredly, honestly, the way you agree to something you've known for a while was fair even before someone made you say it out loud. Arthur Lund drew up a new partnership agreement over the following weeks. It wasn't perfect. I want to tell you that clearly, because I promised you at the beginning that this story wasn't going to wrap up too neatly, and it didn't. Gary and I are not close, even now, a year later. We're cordial. We're partners on paper and, increasingly, partners in the actual daily decisions of the store, which is more than I had before, and I've made my peace with the fact that it might be all we ever have. He still shows up late some mornings. He still occasionally makes decisions that I have to quietly fix before a customer notices, and some old, tired part of me still has to bite down on the urge to say something sharp about it. But he also, for the first time in his adult life, started actually asking my opinion before making changes to the store, and last spring, without me prompting him at all, he told a supplier rep who'd called him the owner that his sister was the owner too, and had been for 21 years whether the paperwork said so or not. It was a small sentence. It meant more to me than I expected it to. My mother and I talk more now, but carefully, the way you talk to someone after a long illness, grateful for what's still there, aware of how easily it could relapse. She's never fully acknowledged the years of the imbalance, not in the sweeping way some part of me once wanted her to. I've had to make peace with the fact that some people give you what they're capable of giving, and it's not always the full apology you deserve, and you can either keep waiting for the rest of it or you can decide the partial version is enough to build something on. I chose to build something on it. Some days that choice feels like strength. Some days it still feels like settling. I've learned both of those things can be true at once. The financial side worked out better than I'd let myself hope. My new salary reflects what I actually do, which after 21 years felt less like a raise and more like finally being paid in the currency of the truth. The store itself is doing well, better, actually, since Gary started deferring to me on ordering and staffing, the two things I'd quietly been right about for 2 decades without anyone officially crediting me for it. Carol still teases me about the Target Karens more than she teases me about any of this, which honestly might be the healthiest thing about my whole year. She says it's because that story has a clean ending, funny, satisfying, over in an afternoon, and the family story doesn't, not really, not the way stories are supposed to end in the movies. She's right. Life mostly doesn't hand you clean endings. There was one moment, a few months after the new partnership agreement was signed, that I think about almost as often as I think about the confrontation itself. It was a Saturday in early spring, the kind of gray, wet Wisconsin day where nobody wants to be outside doing yard work but everybody suddenly remembers they need a new hose or a bag of grass seed the second the temperature climbs above 40. The store was busier than usual, and Gary and I were both behind the counter at the same time, which almost never happened in the old days, back when he treated his hours there as more of a suggestion than a schedule. A regular customer, a contractor named Dale who'd been coming in for supplies since before I even started working there full-time, made some offhand comment to Gary about how it must be nice, finally having his sister officially on board to help him run things. I watched Gary's face for a second, waiting, out of old habit, for him to let that comment stand the easy way, the way that would have cost him nothing and let him keep all the credit for himself. Instead he said, plainly, in front of Dale and 2 other customers waiting in line, that Diane had been running this place for 2 decades, he'd just been slow to make it official, and if Dale wanted to know who actually kept this store standing all these years, it wasn't him. It was me. Dale laughed and said he'd always known that, everybody in town had always known that, and Gary just kind of nodded, a little sheepish, and got back to ringing up the next customer. It was such a small moment. 30 seconds, maybe, in the middle of an ordinary Saturday. But I stood there afterward, refilling a bin of wood screws, and I felt something settle in my chest that even the signed partnership agreement hadn't quite settled, the sense that the truth wasn't just documented anymore, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet somewhere. It was being spoken, out loud, in front of witnesses, by the one person in my family who'd had the least motivation to say it. I've had other moments like that since, smaller ones, scattered through the ordinary weeks, my mother, unprompted, correcting a cousin at a family barbecue who'd referred to Gary's store, saying, a little stiffly but firmly, it's Gary and Diane's store, actually. Ray, watching me come home some evenings tired but not defeated, tired the way I used to be, telling me I seemed different this year, lighter, like I finally put down something heavy I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't just part of my own weight. I won't pretend the anger is entirely gone. Some days, usually when I'm tired or when Gary makes a decision that reminds me of the old carelessness, I feel a flash of the old resentment rise up, sharp and familiar. But it passes faster now than it used to, because it no longer has 21 years of silence to feed on. It just has an ordinary bad day, the kind every business partnership has, the kind that resolves itself with a conversation instead of a lifetime of swallowed words. It hands you Thursdays in a conference room, and imperfect apologies, and brothers who change by inches instead of leaps, and you learn to call that enough, because the alternative is waiting forever for a version of justice that was never coming in the shape you originally imagined. I still think about that folding chair sometimes, the one I sat in the day the will was first read, in my beige blazer, trying to look like I belonged somewhere I'd already been told, without anyone saying it outright, that I did not belong. I think about how small I made myself in that chair, how quiet, how careful not to give anyone a reason to call me difficult. Not long ago, I was back in that same conference room. Arthur Lund still handles some of the store's legal work, signing off on a minor lease amendment, nothing dramatic, just paperwork. And they'd set up the same folding chairs around that same table, because apparently Arthur's never replaced them in 30 years of practice. I sat down in one of them, in my regular work clothes, no blazer, no performance, just myself, and I signed my name, Diane Kowalski, co-owner, on a line that had my actual title on it for the first time in 21 years. I looked up and caught my own reflection for a second in the window behind Arthur's desk, and I didn't see the woman who used to make herself small in that chair. I saw someone who'd finally stopped waiting to be handed what she'd already earned, and had gone and gotten it herself instead, quietly, the way I do most things. I thought about Walter, too, in that moment, and about Delphine's letter, still folded in my kitchen drawer at home. I hope he knows, wherever he is, that I understood, eventually, both halves of what he was trying to say, that he was sorry, and that he hoped I'd understand. I do understand. I understand that people who love you can still fail you, not always out of malice, sometimes just out of the exhausted, fumbling way people try to fix one problem and accidentally create another. I understand that being underestimated for 21 years doesn't mean you have to spend the next 21 being angry about it. And I understand, now, in a way I didn't in that first folding chair, that quiet isn't the same thing as small. I was quiet for 2 decades. I was never actually small. I just hadn't yet made anyone else see the difference. That's the story, more or less. The store's still standing on Main Street, same sign, though I did finally get in Diane added underneath the family name, in small letters, at the bottom of the window, Gary's idea, actually, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that whole year. Some Saturdays I still stock shelves myself, because I like the smell of cut lumber and the particular staleness of an old cash register too much to ever fully let it go. And every so often, some stranger wanders in wearing the wrong color shirt and gets mistaken for an employee, and I always think of that woman at Target, and I smile, because I finally understand something I didn't back then. The trick was never learning how to convince people you belong somewhere. The trick is knowing it yourself, quietly, completely, long before anyone else catches up. If you'd told me, sitting in that folding chair in my beige blazer, that a year later I'd be sitting in that same room signing my real name under my real title, I don't think I'd have believed you. I think I'd have thanked you politely for the kind thought and gone back to being grateful for whatever I was given, because that's what 21 years had trained me to do. I'm glad, now, that the woman who finally walked back into that office with a folder full of proof didn't need anyone else's permission to believe it was possible. She'd already given it to herself.